At first glance, it is only a street, a row of stone facades, iron balconies, shop windows, a doorway half a level below the pavement, bricked shut and easy to miss unless the light catches the old lintel. Then another, and another. In one city it appears as basement windows opening onto dirt. In another, as arches cut off at the knees by asphalt. In another, entire floors seem to have sunk into the earth while the buildings above remain straight, deliberate, complete. The photograph is ordinary until you notice the proportions. The doors are too tall for cellars. The windows were never meant to look out into soil. And once you see it, the city stops looking built. It starts looking buried. The accepted explanation is not mysterious. Cities change. Streets are raised to improve drainage. Rubble accumulates after fires, floods, wars, earthquakes, and demolition. New foundations cut through old neighborhoods. Rivers shift. Harbors are filled. Walls come down. Sewers go in. One generation builds on the debris of the last because clearing everything would cost too much and take too long. Archaeologists have known this for a long time. Rome sits on Rome, London sits on London, Istanbul, Paris, Cairo, Mexico City, Jerusalem, Xi'an, Naples, Prague, Lisbon, New York, Boston, Moscow, and dozens more preserve earlier streets, foundations, tunnels, wells, drains, and rooms below the visible city. Officially, there is no secret here, only urban history. And yet the official explanation, while true, often feels incomplete. Not because rebuilding is rare, but because the scale is wrong. What appears in the record is not merely a few old stones beneath a modern block. It is repeated evidence of entire working ground levels lost below current ones, stairways that descend to what were once entrances, lower windows aligned with former sidewalks, buried retaining walls with finished exterior faces, maps showing streets that no longer exist at the elevation where they were first drawn. Photographs capturing whole districts during moments of excavation, with the city exposed like a cut section in rock. The normal account explains the principle. It does not always explain the pattern. How much of the world's urban surface is not original ground at all? The theory, stated carefully, is less dramatic than legend and more unsettling than folklore. It is this. Many major cities were not simply expanded over time, but physically raised, resurfaced, and reclassified on a scale the public rarely visualizes, until older cities became structural sublayers beneath newer official ones, not hidden in a theatrical sense, not necessarily concealed by a single plan, but absorbed by policy, engineering, sanitation, property law, and selective memory. The maps do not prove a fantasy civilization. They suggest something more concrete. The modern city may often be the visible roof of an older city that was never fully removed, only buried, repurposed, and forgotten. Begin with the simplest evidence, the buildings themselves. In city after city, 19th century and early 20th century photographs show streets being graded upward around structures that were already standing, not rebuilt from scratch, not demolished and replaced. The same masonry, the same openings, the same cornice lines, but with lower doors blocked and lower windows converted into basement lights. In Chicago, after the street-raising projects of the 1850s and 1860s, entire blocks were physically lifted with jacks so new sewer grades could pass beneath them. In Seattle, after the Great Fire, new streets were elevated above old ones, leaving the earlier sidewalks and storefronts below. In Sacramento, flood control produced similar changes. These are famous examples because the documentation survived. The question is not whether it happened there. The question is how often it happened elsewhere without becoming civic legend. Then there are the maps. Not decorative maps, working maps, insurance maps, cadastral sheets, sewer plans, fire atlases, military surveys, and harbour charts. These are the paper skeleton of the city. They record widths, grades, parcels, walls, culverts, embankments, and structures too mundane to invent. Lay enough of them across time and a strange visual logic emerges. Blocks remain, but their surfaces change. Steps appear where level access once existed. Rear courts become wells. Former alleys turn into buried service corridors. Waterfront lines migrate outward as fill advances. Streams vanish into pipes. Ravines become boulevards. Entire districts flatten on paper, but only after years of retaining works and infill. There is a before and after to urban ground itself. What matters is that the change is often treated as incidental in public memory, even when it is foundational in the record. Consider the legal record. Because cities do not bury themselves without paperwork, street improvement ordinances, sewer appropriations, condemnation notices, grade adjustment hearings, retaining wall contracts, fill licenses, port authority expansions, railway cut and cover authorizations, property disputes over changed access. These documents rarely speak the language of mystery. They speak in measurements and compensation. So many cubic yards of fill, so many feet added to the grade, so many entrances to be relocated. A cellar becomes a basement not by geology alone, but by legal definition. A first floor becomes a lower ground level because the municipality redraws the relationship between private structure and public street. What changed was the explanation. The stone remembers. The paperwork translates. The geological evidence is quieter, but it matters. Urban excavation repeatedly reveals anthropogenic layers thick enough to behave like a man-made formation. Demolition: brick, ash, timber, ceramics, slag, compacted soil, reworked clay, imported gravel, dredged sediment, refuse, collapsed plaster, and fill from cut hills, all settle into stacked deposits. In some cities, the depth is modest. In others, it reaches astonishing thickness. Not in one neat event, but through successive episodes of rebuilding, leveling, and infill. Ancient tells in the Near East are the famous example. Cities built upon cities until settlements rose as artificial mounds above the plain. But the process did not stop in antiquity. Industrial cities produced their own stratigraphy, dense enough that archaeologists now read modern urban layers almost like geology. The pattern does not disappear. It only becomes administrative. Old photographs sharpen the problem because they capture transition. There is a peculiar kind of image that appears across continents, a city under excavation or reconstruction, with facades exposed below the present line of movement. Workers stand where later pedestrians will not. Temporary stairways connect two eras at once. Streetcars run past buildings whose lower stories are still visible, but not for long. Embankments of fresh earth lean against dressed stone. Sewer trenches open like surgical cuts through neighborhoods that had seemed stable. These images are often filed under improvement, widening, modernization, post-fire rebuilding, river control. Fair enough. But taken together, they reveal a recurring urban operation, not just construction, reburial. The mainstream explanation deserves to be stated fairly because much of it is correct. Cities are layered because they are old, crowded, and practical. Debris accumulates. Fires create rubble. Floods deposit sediment. Streets are raised for sanitation. Ports are extended with fill. Hills are cut down and valleys packed in. In weak soil, foundation strategies change. In strong economies, demolishing every obsolete structure is inefficient, so parts are buried, adapted, or left behind. There is no need to invent a vanished empire to explain why lower floors disappear below grade, and yet this conventional account still leaves gaps. It explains why layering happens. It does not always explain why public understanding of scale remains so shallow, why entire buried levels are treated as curiosities, or why similar transformations recur in cities with different climates, governments, and disaster histories. The mechanism is ordinary. The extent is what unsettles. Look at infrastructure that should not exist if the visible surface were the whole story. Arched tunnels too refined for mere crawl spaces. Ventilation shafts leading nowhere obvious from street level. Retired tram passages sealed behind later masonry. Service corridors beneath plazas that were once open lanes. Basement walls with exterior brickwork. Window lintels. And weathering patterns that imply long exposure before burial. In some places, lower storefronts survive as ghost spaces behind subgrade walls. In others, whole understreets remain as utility corridors, storage rooms, or guided tours stripped of context and sold as novelty. The official explanation usually isolates each case. Here a fire, there a flood, elsewhere a rail project. But the record shows a family resemblance, different causes, same result. A city surface elevated above an earlier urban reality. The scale widens further when the same geometry appears in places with no shared mythology at all. North American downtowns, European port districts, Andean colonial centers, Middle Eastern settlements, South Asian trade cities, East Asian capitals. Different materials, different states. Different eras of expansion. Yet the same clues recur. Buried arches, truncated doors, misaligned elevations, old maps at odds with present grade, subsurface masonry treated as incidental during utility work. Sometimes the older layer is ancient. Sometimes it is only 2 centuries old. Sometimes it was intentionally entombed during modernization. Sometimes it was simply absorbed by repetition. The pattern repeats because dense settlement almost always prefers accumulation over erasure. Once land acquires value, the city begins to grow upward and downward at the same time, and eventually its own memory falls behind its mass. Railways and roads accelerated this process in ways that maps capture with unusual clarity. A cut through one neighborhood provided fill for another. Marshland became real estate. Riverbanks became quays. Quays became boulevards. Freight demanded flatter grades than old topography allowed. Sewers demanded slopes that medieval streets did not provide. The solution was not to start again. It was to reorganize the ground. Some cities lowered hills and pushed the spoil into tidal flats. Others raised central districts to outrun disease and floodwater. In many places, the largest earth-moving operations were not ancient at all. They were modern, bureaucratic, contract-driven, and photographed. The missing piece is not evidence. It is synthesis. The record is still there. There is also the question of classification. Once a space is renamed, it is effectively moved in the public mind. A buried first floor becomes a basement. A former street becomes a vault. A sealed passage becomes a utility tunnel. A district raised by several feet remains the same district in name, so the psychological break disappears even when the physical break is obvious. This is one reason the deeper story slips away without any dramatic suppression. Bureaucracy is often enough. Engineering drawings are stored in municipal archives. Survey revisions replace earlier contours. Insurance maps go out of print. Old photographs lose their captions. Specialists know fragments, but the fragments do not easily travel between geology, archaeology, urban planning, sanitation history, and public memory. What survives is not a lie exactly. It is a narrowed category. The truth becomes harder to see because no single institution is responsible for telling the whole of it. If there was concealment, it may have looked less like conspiracy than embarrassment, cost, or habit. A city promising progress does not always foreground the fact that its clean new boulevard stands on top of demolished streets, contaminated soil, plague-era drains, flood deposits, and unremoved walls. Property markets reward certainty, governments reward functionality, engineers solve grade problems, archivists preserve what they can, historians specialize, developers build over inconvenient complexity. Public narratives compress. That is how a structural fact can remain hidden in plain sight, not by being locked away, but by being distributed so widely that no one frame can hold it. Economics buries as effectively as earth. This is why the maps matter so much. A photograph can be dismissed as an oddity. A basement can be explained away as local adaptation. A single underground district can be turned into a tourist attraction. But maps show continuity across time and authority. They reveal where elevations changed, where shorelines advanced, where streets were absorbed, where embankments replaced slopes, where culverted watercourses vanished beneath blocks that later appeared natural. Compare map to map, and the city begins to separate into versions of itself. What seems stable from ground level becomes provisional on paper. The familiar plan remains, but the surface is not the same surface. Beneath the current traffic pattern there is often another logic, older and half-preserved. The maps do not shout, they accumulate. Even language preserves traces. Lower town, upper town, undercrofts, vaults, catacombs, subterranean passages, old foundations, sunken gardens, lost rivers, buried wharves, underground markets, service basements. These are not all the same thing, and they should not be forced into one explanation, but they point to a durable relationship between settlement and concealment. Cities do not merely occupy land, they metabolize their own remains. Every solved problem creates the conditions for a later excavation. Every raised grade creates a future basement. Every river put underground becomes a weakness in the map. Every rebuilt district leaves a seam. So the title claim, taken literally, may sound excessive. Not every square meter of every major city sits neatly atop a perfectly preserved predecessor. The urban underworld is fragmented, not uniform. Some places were scraped clean, others were rebuilt in place, others drifted gradually upward through accumulation. Precision matters here. But in another sense, the claim is not excessive enough, because what lies beneath the modern city is not just another city in the romantic archaeological sense. It is a stack of decisions, disasters, contracts, materials, and forgotten surfaces. A sequence of official worlds, each of them once normal, each of them later buried by necessity. What remains, then, is not a fantasy about a lost global civilization, but something more difficult to dismiss. The visible city is incomplete evidence. The streets we trust are not original facts. They are latest versions. The ground floor is often a legal fiction. The basement may once have been public. The plaza may once have been shoreline. The avenue may once have been a ravine. The hill may once have stood 2 stories higher. The harbour may be made ground. The neighbourhood may have another map beneath it, and another below that. The pattern does not disappear. And once that becomes visible, the modern city begins to feel less like a finished place than an exposed cross-section of memory under pressure. Every sealed arch suggests a prior alignment. Every misfit stair hints at a vanished grade. Every old survey line that no longer matches the present terrain suggests intervention at a scale large enough to rewrite daily life, and small enough, somehow, to be forgotten. The official explanation tells us that cities evolve. The hidden pattern suggests they are repeatedly overwritten, then normalized so thoroughly that the overwrite itself becomes invisible. The unsettling part is not that another city lies beneath this one. That has been true for a very long time. The unsettling part is how often the evidence is public, physical, measured, and still not seriously assembled into a single way of seeing, not because the facts are absent, because they are scattered across disciplines that rarely meet, and because ordinary modernization is a less marketable mystery than catastrophe or myth, yet the deeper story may be exactly that ordinary. Entire urban worlds vanished not in legend, but in grading plans, fill permits, sewer contracts, waterfront extensions, and decades of practical indifference. So when you look at an old district and see a window half buried in stone, the question is no longer whether that one building settled, or whether that one street was raised. The question is how many times the same process happened before anyone thought to connect it, how many maps already show it, how many records describe it in technical language that never reached the public imagination. How much of the city beneath the city is still there, not lost, not mythical, simply reclassified. The real question is not whether the theory sounds strange, but whether anyone with the tools to verify it has seriously looked.